Okay, so when you think about the American Revolution, a few names probably pop right into your head, right? Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, the usual suspects. But what about the guy George Washington himself called one of his closest friends and most essential generals? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a truly fascinating figure, Henry Knox. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. That's not just some polite, formal compliment. This is George Washington. The George Washington is saying this guy was basically his best friend and someone he trusted completely. This one quote really tells you just how important Knox was to the whole revolutionary effort.
And that right there is the big question, isn't it? If he was so vital, so important to Washington, why isn't his name as famous as the others? Why has he kind of been lost to history? Well, to figure that out, we've got to go back to the very beginning. To solve this mystery, we actually have to start in a pretty surprising place. See, Knox's story doesn't begin on a battlefield. It doesn't start in some fancy political hall. Nope. It starts among stacks of books in a little shop in Boston. His journey to becoming a general was, let's just say, not the typical career path.
So get this. When Henry was just 9 years old, his father, a shipbuilder, ran into some financial trouble and just left. The whole burden of supporting the family fell on young Knox, so he had to drop out of school and get a job. But that hardship put him in the one place that would change everything, a bookstore. And this is where things get really interesting. Knox didn't just sell books. He read them. All of them. He basically turned his job into his own personal university. He eventually opened his own shop, the London Bookstore, and while it was a popular hangout for Boston's high society, Knox was in the back, just devouring books on military engineering, artillery, and strategy. He was completely self-taught, a true embodiment of that revolutionary idea that what you know matters more than who you are.
All right, picture this. It's the winter of 1775. The brand new Continental Army has the British completely boxed into Boston, but they have a huge problem. They don't have the heavy cannons to actually force them out. This is the moment where our 25-year-old bookseller steps onto the world stage with a plan so bold, so audacious that most seasoned generals thought it was absolutely nuts. Just look at that number, 60 tons. That's the weight of all the cannons, mortars, and firepower that Knox said he could haul 300 miles in the middle of a brutal New England winter. This wasn't just a tough job. It was a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. And the journey itself? It was just grueling. Knox and his men used these huge ox-drawn sleds, and they were battling blizzards and treacherous ice the whole way. I mean, you had cannons literally falling through frozen lakes that they'd have to fish out. They dragged these massive weapons over the steep, snow-covered Berkshire Mountains. It was an unbelievable 6-week ordeal that pushed everyone to their absolute limits. So, what was the result of this impossible mission? A total game-changing success. Washington's army secretly moved the cannons up onto Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city and the British fleet. The next morning, the British woke up, looked up, and realized they were sitting ducks. They had no choice but to pack up and sail away. This was the first major victory for the Americans in the entire war, and it was all thanks to a self-taught artillery genius from a bookstore. That incredible artillery mission, known as the Noble Train, totally cemented Knox's reputation. He was immediately promoted to brigadier general, and for the rest of the war, you'd pretty much always find him right there by Washington's side. He became his chief of artillery, and really, one of his most trusted advisors on everything.
And you can see just how deep his contribution went. He wasn't just at one or two big battles. He was at all of them. Trenton, Princeton, Yorktown, you name it, Knox was there. Remember that famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware? Well, it was Knox who organized the logistics to get all the boats and cannons across the icy river. He even started America's first military school, which was a forerunner to West Point. And when Washington finally stepped down, Knox was the guy left in charge of the entire army. He was that important.
But Knox's service to the country didn't stop when the war ended. Not even close. He was also a key player in building the new government, shaping the nation's military, and, this might surprise you, its policies toward Native American tribes. His influence went way beyond the battlefield. He became the first Secretary of War, a job he actually had even before the Constitution was written.
He was responsible for the entire U.S. military, and a massive, massive part of that job was figuring out the incredibly complicated relationship between the new United States and the powerful Indian nations living on its borders.
Now, this is where Knox's thinking got really complex, and for its time, pretty progressive. The common attitude back then was something called right of conquest. Basically, the U.S. believed it had won the land from the British and their Indian allies in the war, so it was theirs to take. But Knox argued that this was not only unfair, it was also just not going to work. He pushed for a different policy, a right of purchase, which recognized that Indian nations actually owned their land and that the U.S. had to acquire it through legal, formal treaties. That was a pretty radical idea back then.
This quote, man, it just tells you everything about his mindset. Knox was deeply worried about the country's reputation, about its legacy. He was afraid that if America just conquered and took land by force, future generations would look back and see no difference between America and the brutal Spanish conquistadors. Now, don't get me wrong, his policy was still designed to acquire land for the U.S., but he was adamant that it had to be done legally, with an eye towards the nation's honor. So, after all that, a heroic military career, a foundational role in the new government, we have to come back to our original question. With a resume like this, how on earth did Henry Knox become the forgotten founder?
All right, let's break it down. It wasn't really one single thing, but more like a perfect storm of different factors that kind of pushed him into the shadows of our national memory.
First, and maybe this is the most obvious one, he was always standing next to a giant. It's pretty tough for anyone to stand out when they're George Washington's right-hand man. Then, there's just some tragic timing. The people who knew his value best, Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Nathaniel Greene, they all died relatively young, so there was no one left to really sing his praises and protect his legacy. Politics played a huge part too. When Thomas Jefferson's party came to power, Federalists like Knox were totally out of favor. And finally, his personal story took a tough turn. In his retirement, he got into some bad land deals and ended up deeply in debt, which really tarnished his public image. Ultimately, the story of Henry Knox is a powerful reminder that history isn't just about what happened. It's also about who tells the story and whose story gets told. For every famous icon we celebrate, you have to believe there are other indispensable people whose incredible contributions, for whatever reason, fate, politics, or just bad timing, have kind of faded away. It really makes you wonder, who else is out there just waiting for us to rediscover them?